Sometimes the people we save end up saving us. Sometimes the hardest journeys lead us exactly where we need to be. 67-year-old Holt has lived alone in the mountains for decades, haunted by the son he lost. When he rescues 19-year-old Kiara from a raging river, she asks him to take her to an old well in the ruins of a forgotten fort. She says it holds answers about her missing mother. What they find there changes everything. The well holds more than water. It holds secrets that connect their lives in ways neither could imagine. Their discovery will heal old wounds and reveal a truth that transforms them both. What could be buried so deep that it gives a broken man the forgiveness he never thought he deserved? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine needles like memories that refused to fade, and Holt Matthews knew that feeling all too well. At 67, his hands bore the calluses of a man who had built his life from timber and stone, carved his existence from the unforgiving wilderness of the Colorado Rockies. The cabin he called home sat nestled in a grove of ancient pines, 8,000 feet above sea level, where the air was thin and the silence was thick enough to wrap around a man's shoulders like a heavy coat. He sat on his porch, watching the sun climb over the eastern peaks, a steaming cup of coffee warming his weathered palms. The hand-carved wooden cross in his shirt pocket pressed against his chest, a reminder he carried everywhere, worn smooth from 20 years of handling. He had carved it himself the day after Thomas died, sitting by his son's grave with tears freezing on his cheeks and wood shavings falling like snow onto the fresh earth. Thomas would have been 42 this year. The thought came unbidden, as it did every morning, settling in his chest like a familiar ache. His boy had been 22 when the accident happened, young, stubborn, full of dreams that Holt had thought were foolish at the time. How wrong he had been about so many things. The cabin around him told the story of a man who had withdrawn from the world. Every log had been cut and placed by his own hands, every stone in the chimney carefully selected from the creek bed below. The furniture was simple, functional, a table and chairs he had built, shelves lined with books about wilderness survival, hunting guides, and a few worn volumes of poetry that had belonged to his late wife, Margaret. She had died when Thomas was 15, taken by cancer that moved through her like wildfire, leaving both father and son to navigate their grief in different directions. Holt had thrown himself into work then, logging in the lower valleys, coming home each night exhausted and hollow. Thomas had thrown himself into books and dreams, talking about college, about seeing the world beyond these mountains. They had grown apart like two trees planted too close together, each reaching for different light. The kitchen held the bare essentials, cast iron pans that could last generations, mason jars filled with preserved vegetables from his small garden, smoked meat hanging from hooks he had forged himself. He hunted what he needed, fished the streams that ran clear and cold from the snowpack above, and made the 2-hour hike down to the small town of Cedar Falls only when his supplies ran low. Most folks in town knew him as the hermit who lived up on Whitmore Ridge. They were polite enough when he came in for flour, salt and ammunition, but they kept their distance. They sensed the weight he carried, the invisible barrier he had built around himself. Some remembered him from before Margaret died, before Thomas was lost, when he had been a different man entirely. He remembered those days sometimes, usually late at night when the wind howled through the pines and sleep eluded him. He had been a father then, a husband, a man with roots that ran deep into the community below. He had coached Thomas's little league team, sat in church beside Margaret every Sunday, attended town meetings and harvest festivals. He had been part of something larger than himself. The accident had changed all of that in a single, terrible moment. It had happened on a day much like this one, with clear skies and the promise of an early spring thaw. Thomas had been working on a logging crew in the valley, making money for college. Holt had been proud of his son's work ethic, even if he couldn't understand the boy's dreams of leaving the mountains behind. The tree had fallen wrong, a widowmaker they called it, a dead branch high in the canopy that chose that moment to break free. Holt had been the one to find him. The memory still woke him in the darkest hours of the night when the cabin creaked and settled around him like old bones. Thomas lying there in the forest, his hard hat cracked, his young face peaceful in a way that made Holt's heart break all over again. The medic said he wouldn't have suffered, that it had been quick, but that knowledge did nothing to ease the crushing weight of guilt that followed. If only he had been there. If only he had taught Thomas to watch for widowmakers more carefully. If only he had supported his son's dreams instead of expecting him to follow in his footsteps. The if-onlys had driven him up into these high places, away from the memories and the well-meaning sympathy of neighbors who couldn't possibly understand. His daily routines had become a form of meditation, a way to keep his hands busy and his mind from wandering too far into the dark places. He rose with the sun, checked his snares, tended his small garden in the brief growing season, and maintained his equipment with the precision of a man who knew his life depended on it. In the winter months, he split wood and repaired what needed fixing, read by lamplight, and listened to the old radio that sometimes picked up stations from as far away as Denver. The mountains had become his church, his confessor, his closest companion. He knew every trail for 20 miles in any direction, every creek and ridge, every place where the elk liked to graze and the bears denned up for winter. He could read the weather in the way the wind shifted through the trees, predict storms by the behavior of the birds, navigate by stars that had guided his ancestors across oceans he would never see. But for all his knowledge of this wild place, he had never learned to navigate the landscape of his own grief. It remained as trackless and dangerous as any wilderness, full of hidden crevasses and sudden storms that could leave a man lost and broken. The animals had become his closest neighbors. A family of chipmunks lived under his porch, chattering their opinions about his morning activities. An old black bear he had named Moses occasionally wandered through his clearing, more curious than threatening after years of peaceful coexistence. Hawks circled the thermals above his ridge, and eagles nested in the dead snag that stood sentinel at the edge of his property. He talked to them sometimes when the silence grew too heavy. They were better listeners than most people had ever been, offering no judgments, no advice, no platitudes about time healing all wounds. They simply accepted his presence in their domain, recognizing him as part of the natural order rather than an intruder to be feared or pitied. The hand-carved cross seemed to pulse against his chest as he finished his coffee, a reminder of the promise he had made at Thomas's graveside. He had sworn to live a life worthy of his son's memory, to honor the young man who had dreamed of making a difference in the world. But somewhere along the way, that promise had become a sentence of isolation, a punishment he inflicted on himself for the crime of surviving when his boy had not. As he stood to begin his daily rounds, the morning sun caught the metal of Thomas's old compass hanging from a nail beside the door. The boy had loved that compass, had carried it on every hiking trip, every camping adventure. Holt had found it among his son's belongings after the funeral, and it had become another artifact of memory, another weight to carry. The wilderness called to him as it always did, promising solitude and the kind of peace that came from physical exhaustion. He shouldered his day pack, checked his rifle, and stepped off the porch into another day of self-imposed exile. The mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, beautiful and indifferent, holding their secrets close and offering no easy answers to the questions that haunted him. Somewhere in the distance, a creek ran swift and cold with snowmelt, carrying the memories of winter down toward the valleys below. Holt couldn't have known that by evening, that same creek would bring something into his life that would change everything. A young woman with secrets of her own. A journey that would lead them both toward a truth neither could imagine. For now, he walked alone through the morning forest, the wooden cross pressing against his heart, carrying his grief like a backpack that had become so familiar he barely noticed its weight anymore. The sound reached Holt before he could identify what it was, A cry carried on the wind, so faint he almost dismissed it as a hawk's call echoing off the canyon walls. He had been checking his snares along the creek that ran behind his property, the same creek that would swell to a torrent when the snowpack above began its earnest melt. But this was different, more urgent, almost human. He paused, one hand on the empty snare, listening with the attention of a man who had learned to read the wilderness like scripture. There it was again, definitely human, and definitely in distress. The cry came from downstream, where the creek curved around a bend and dropped into a series of rapids that could turn deadly when the water ran high. Holt abandoned his trapline and moved quickly through the pine forest, his 67-year-old legs carrying him with the sure-footed grace of someone who had spent decades navigating this terrain. The sound of rushing water grew louder as he approached the creek, and when he crested the small rise that overlooked the rapids, his heart nearly stopped. A young woman thrashed in the churning water, her dark hair streaming behind her as the current carried her toward the rocks. She couldn't have been more than 20, and she was losing her fight against the snow-melt-swollen creek. Her movements were growing weaker, more desperate, and Holt could see she had maybe seconds before the water would claim her completely. Without thinking, he shed his pack and rifle, kicking off his boots as he plunged down the steep bank. The water hit him like a physical blow, so cold it drove the breath from his lungs and sent shockwaves through his system. But he had swum in these mountain streams before, knew how to work with the current instead of fighting it. The young woman's head disappeared beneath the surface just as Holt reached the main channel. He dove, his eyes burning in the icy water, searching for any sign of her. His lungs screamed for air, but he forced himself deeper, following the current's logic, trying to think like the water itself. His hand brushed fabric, then closed around an arm. He pulled her up, breaking the surface just as his own lungs were about to give out. She was unconscious, her face pale as winter snow, but she was breathing, barely. Getting her to shore meant swimming across the current toward a small eddy he knew formed behind a fallen log. Every stroke was a battle against water that wanted to carry them both downstream toward the larger rapids below. His muscles burned with the effort, his aging body protesting the demands he was placing on it. But he had pulled heavier loads from these mountains before. When he finally dragged her onto the rocky shore, she was blue around the lips and shivering violently. Hypothermia was setting in fast, and they were still a quarter-mile from his cabin. He gathered her in his arms, surprised by how light she was, and began the climb back up the bank. The trek to his cabin felt like the longest quarter-mile of his life. She was unconscious, but breathing, and he could feel her heart beating against his chest as he carried her. Her clothes were soaked through, and he knew he had to get her warm and dry quickly or lose her to the cold that had already started its deadly work. He kicked open his cabin door and went straight to the bedroom, laying her on his bed before rushing to build up the fire in the main room. The flames caught quickly. He always kept dry kindling ready, and soon the cabin was filling with warmth. He gathered every blanket he owned, then returned to find her still unconscious but shivering less violently, working with the efficiency of someone who had dealt with emergencies in the wilderness before. He removed her wet clothes and wrapped her in the dry blankets. Her breathing was steady but shallow, and her skin was still far too cold. He stoked the fire higher, boiled water for tea, and settled in to wait. It was then, as he sat watching over her, that he noticed the silver locket clutched in her left hand. Even unconscious, she held it tight against her palm, as if it contained something too precious to lose. The locket was tarnished with age but still beautiful, delicate filigree work that spoke of craftsmanship from another era. She stirred as the warmth began to penetrate her system, her eyelids fluttering before finally opening to reveal eyes the color of storm clouds. For a moment she seemed confused, disoriented, then her gaze found his, and fear flickered across her features. "You're safe," he said quietly, keeping his voice gentle. "I'm Holt. I pulled you from the creek." "You're in my cabin." She tried to sit up, then thought better of it, as the room seemed to spin around her. Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Thank you. What's your name?" "Kiara." She clutched the locket tighter, pressing it against her chest. "My name is Kiara." "Well, Kiara, you nearly drowned. What were you doing in that water?" Her eyes darted away from his, and he could see her struggling with how much to tell him. She was young, 19, maybe 20, with the kind of face that spoke of determination beneath the exhaustion and fear. "I was trying to cross," she said finally. "I need to get to the old fort ruins, up in the high country." Holt frowned. He knew the area she was talking about, though he'd never had reason to go there. The ruins were remote, dangerous to reach, and as far as he knew, there was nothing up there but old stones and local legends. The fort ruins? That's a hard 2-day hike from here, through some of the roughest country in these mountains. What could possibly be up there that's worth risking your life? Kiara's grip on the locket tightened, and for a moment he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she looked at him with eyes that held too much sadness for someone so young. "There's a well," she said. "An old well in the ruins. I have to find it." "A well?" Holt couldn't hide his skepticism. "There are plenty of wells closer to civilization." "Why that one?" "Because that's where my mother disappeared." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Holt studied her face, seeing the pain there, the desperate hope that had driven her to attempt such a dangerous crossing. "When did she disappear?" 15 years ago. "I was 4. Kiara's voice was stronger now, warmed by the fire and her own determination. "I've been searching for answers my whole life. The well is the only clue I have left." Holt felt something stir in his chest, a recognition of the kind of loss that could drive a person to desperate measures. He thought of his own son, of the questions that would never be answered, and found himself leaning forward. "What makes you think you'll find answers there?" Kiara opened the locket, revealing a small photograph of a beautiful woman with the same storm-grey eyes. This was the last place anyone saw her. She went there looking for something, and she never came back. The local sheriff gave up searching after a few weeks. Said she probably just ran off, started a new life somewhere else. "But you don't believe that?" "No." Her voice was firm despite her exhaustion. "She wouldn't have left me. Not willingly. Something happened to her up there, and I need to know what." Holt stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains that had been his refuge for so many years. He knew those peaks, knew how they could swallow a person without a trace, how they kept their secrets buried under snow and stone. He also knew what it was like to live with questions that had no answers. When he turned back to her, Kiara was sitting up straighter, her color returning as the warmth worked its way through her system. "You can't make that journey alone," he said. "Even if I tell you the route, there are places where one wrong step means 1,000-foot fall. And the weather up there can turn deadly without warning. Then come with me." The words came out before she could stop them, and they both seemed surprised by her boldness. Holt shook his head. "I don't leave these mountains anymore. Haven't in 20 years. Please." There was something in her voice that reminded him of Thomas when he was young, that same mixture of determination and vulnerability. "I can pay you. I have money." "It's not about money." "Then what is it about?" He looked at her for a long moment. This young woman who had literally fallen into his life, bringing with her a request that would take him further from his self-imposed exile than he had been in decades. Part of him wanted to refuse, to send her on her way once she was strong enough to travel. But another part, a part he had thought was buried with his son, responded to the desperate hope in her eyes. "It's about staying where I belong," he said finally. But even as he spoke the words, he could feel his resolve beginning to weaken. By morning, Kiara's color had returned to normal, though Holt could see she was still weak from her ordeal in the creek. She sat at his small kitchen table, wrapped in one of his flannel shirts that hung loose on her slight frame, sipping the herbal tea he had brewed from plants he gathered in the high meadows. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly, watching him organize supplies on the kitchen counter. "I know you don't want to leave." Holt paused in his packing, his weathered hands resting on the old military compass that had belonged to him long before he became a hermit. The brass casing was worn smooth from years of use, and the needle still pointed true north with the reliability that had guided him through younger, more adventurous days. Before Margaret died, Before Thomas was lost? Before he had chosen exile over engagement with the world? No, he said, not looking at her. I don't want to leave, but I can't let you go up there alone. These mountains don't forgive mistakes, and you've already used up most of your luck. He had spent the night wrestling with the decision, pacing his cabin while she slept the deep sleep of exhaustion. Every rational part of him screamed against it. He was 67 years old. His knees ached in the mornings, and he had built his life around avoiding exactly this kind of complication. But something about her desperation, the way she clutched that locket like a lifeline, had broken through defenses he had spent 20 years building. Tell me about this well, he said, adding dried meat to his pack. What exactly do you know about it? Kiara opened the locket again, staring at her mother's photograph. Not much, just that it's old, older than the fort itself. The local historians said it was there when the first settlers arrived, carved right into the stone foundation. They built the fort around it because it was the only reliable water source for miles. And your mother went there alone? She had been researching our family history. Said she had found something in old records, something about our ancestors and that place. Kiara's voice grew quieter. She was excited about it, more excited than I had ever seen her. She told me she was going to find answers to questions our family had carried for generations. Holt added medical supplies to his pack, including bandages and antiseptic that could mean the difference between life and death in the wilderness. He had learned to prepare for every contingency after losing Thomas. Too little, too late. What kind of questions? I don't know. She never got the chance to tell me. Frustration colored Kiara's voice. I was only 4. All I remember is her saying goodbye, promising she would be back in a few days with wonderful news. That was the last time I saw her. The compass seemed to grow heavier in Holt's hand as he considered the journey ahead. The route to the fort ruins would take them through some of the most challenging terrain in the Rockies. Narrow ridges where a misplaced step meant certain death. Exposed slopes where sudden weather could trap them for days. And country so remote that if something went wrong, no one would ever find their bodies. The sheriff really just gave up? He asked, testing the weight of his pack. After 3 weeks of searching, he said the wilderness had claimed plenty of people over the years, and my mother was just another victim of her own foolishness. Anger flashed in Kiara's storm-gray eyes. He never understood that she wasn't some city woman who didn't know the dangers. She had grown up in these mountains, knew them almost as well as you do. Holt nodded thoughtfully. He remembered a few searches over the years, helicopters circling the peaks, teams of volunteers combing the easier trails. Most of them ended the same way, with families learning to live with questions that would never be answered. We'll need to travel light, he said, gesturing to a smaller pack. Take only what you absolutely need. The high country doesn't forgive excess weight. Kiara stood carefully, still moving, like someone who had been through an ordeal. I brought camping gear, but I lost most of it in the creek. I have what we need. Holt opened a storage closet and began pulling out equipment he hadn't used in years. A lightweight tent designed for mountain conditions. Sleeping bags rated for temperatures that could drop below freezing even in summer. A portable stove that would work at altitude. Each piece of gear brought back memories of trips he had taken with Thomas when the boy was younger. Before their relationship had become strained by different dreams and misunderstanding. His son had loved the high country, had talked about becoming a mountain guide before practical concerns about making a living had steered him toward logging work. How long since you've been up there? Kiara asked, watching him check the condition of climbing ropes. To the fort ruins? Never, but I know the country around it. He coiled a rope with practiced efficiency, muscle memory taking over despite the years. The approach will be the hardest part. Once we're above the tree line, the going gets easier but more dangerous. Weather can change in minutes up there. What about wildlife? Bears mostly. Some mountain lions. They won't bother us if we're smart about food storage and make enough noise on the trail. He paused, considering. The bigger danger is the country itself. Rock slides, sudden storms, sections where the trail disappears entirely. Kiara nodded, and he could see her filing away each piece of information. Despite her youth and the ordeal she had been through, there was a competence about her that suggested she wasn't entirely unprepared for wilderness travel. "Where did you learn about the outdoors?" he asked. "My grandmother. After my mother disappeared, I went to live with her in Montana. She had been a hunting guide in her younger days, taught me everything she knew about surviving in wild places." A sad smile crossed Kiara's face. "She said my mother had been the same way, always drawn to the wilderness, always looking for something just beyond the next ridge." Holt felt a familiar pang in his chest. How many times had he seen that same restless spirit in Thomas? That need to explore, to push boundaries, to find meaning in the vast spaces beyond the safety of home. "We'll leave at first light," he said, shouldering his pack to test its weight. "The first day's hike will be through familiar country, but we'll need to make good time. There's only one decent camping spot between here and the high passes." "Holt," Kiara's voice stopped him as he moved toward the door. "Why are you really doing this?" He stood with his hand on the doorframe, looking out at mountains that had been his sanctuary and his prison for 20 years. The honest answer was complicated, part guilt over his own lost opportunities, part recognition of a pain that mirrored his own, in part simple human decency that couldn't let a young woman face such dangers alone. "Because," he said finally, "sometimes helping someone else find their answers is the only way to live with your own questions." The compass in his pack seemed to pulse with possibility, pointing not just toward magnetic north, but toward a journey that would take them both far from the safety of known trails. They set out before dawn, when the world was painted in shades of grey and silver, and the only sounds were their boots crunching on frost-covered pine needles. Holt led the way with the steady pace of someone who understood that mountain travel was about endurance, not speed. Behind him, Kiara moved quietly, adapting to his rhythm with the kind of natural grace that spoke of real wilderness experience. The first hours took them through country. Holt knew like the lines on his own hands, gentle slopes covered in lodgepole pine, clearings where deer grazed in the early morning light, streams that ran clear and cold from the snowpack above. It was familiar territory, comforting in its predictability, but he knew that comfort would disappear once they climbed above the tree line. "Your grandmother taught you well," he said during their first rest stop, watching Kiara efficiently adjust her pack straps and check her water bottle. "Most people from the city would be struggling by now. She always said the mountains would teach you everything you needed to know, if you were smart enough to listen." Kiara pulled out a faded map, unfolding it carefully on a fallen log. "She marked some of the places my mother used to go when she was researching our family history." Holt studied the map, noting the careful pencil marks that indicated campsites, water sources, and potential hazards. It was the work of someone who understood the country, who had spent real time learning its moods and dangers. "Your grandmother is still alive. She passed away 2 years ago. Lung cancer." Kiara's voice carried the familiar weight of loss. "That's when I decided I couldn't wait any longer to find answers about my mother. Grandma Rose always said I would know when the time was right." They resumed walking, climbing steadily now as the trail switchbacked up the side of a ridge. The familiar weight of the pack on Holt's shoulders brought back memories of other hikes, other times when the mountains had been a source of joy rather than refuge. Thomas had loved these early morning starts, the way the world revealed itself slowly as the sun climbed higher. "Tell me about your family," Holt said, partly to learn more about her and partly to keep his own memories at bay. "Besides your mother and grandmother, not much family to speak of. My father died when I was a baby, car accident. My mother never remarried, never even dated as far as I know. It was just the three of us for a while, then just Grandma Rose and me after Mother disappeared. That must have been hard, growing up with so many unanswered questions." Kiara was quiet for several steps, navigating around a fallen tree that blocked the trail. The hardest part was not knowing if she was out there somewhere, maybe hurt, maybe trapped, maybe just unable to find her way home. "For years I imagined I would turn a corner and there she would be, waiting for me with that smile she always had." The trail grew steeper, and conversation became more difficult as they focused on the demands of the climb. Holt could feel his body remembering skills he hadn't used in years: how to breathe efficiently at altitude, how to place his feet on loose scree, how to read the subtle signs that warned of unstable ground ahead. By midday, they had reached the edge of the wilderness area, marked by a weathered wooden sign that warned hikers about the dangers ahead. Beyond this point, there would be no marked trails, no easy bailouts if the weather turned bad or someone got injured. "Last chance to change your mind," Holt said, though he could see in Kiara's face that she had no intention of turning back. Not a chance. She adjusted her pack and looked up at the peaks that rose like cathedral spires against the blue sky. "I've come too far to quit now." They stopped for lunch beside a small alpine lake that reflected the surrounding peaks like a mirror. The water was so clear Holt could see trout moving lazily in the depths, and the silence was so complete it seemed to have weight and substance. "It's beautiful," Kiara said, sitting on a sun-warmed boulder. "I can see why you love it up here." "It wasn't always about escape," Holt said, surprising himself with the admission. "I used to bring my son up here when he was younger. He loved the high country, said it made him feel closer to something bigger than himself. What happened to him?" The question hung in the air, like smoke from their small cooking fire. Holt had avoided talking about Thomas for so long that the words felt rusty when they finally came. Logging accident. 20 years ago. He was working to save money for college, wanted to study forestry, maybe become a park ranger. Holt stared into the clear water of the lake. "I thought his dreams were foolish at the time, thought he should stay close to home, learn a practical trade. I'm sorry. The thing is, he was right about this place. It does make you feel connected to something larger. But after he died, that connection felt more like accusation than comfort." Kiara was quiet for a long moment, then pulled out her mother's locket and opened it. "Grandma Rose used to say that the people we lose don't really leave us. They just move to a different kind of presence in our lives. Your grandmother sounds like she was a wise woman." She was. She also said that sometimes we have to walk into the hard places to find the healing we need. After lunch, the terrain began to change dramatically. They left the last of the tall pines behind and entered a world of granite and sky, where the air grew thin and the sun felt both warmer and more dangerous. The trail, such as it was, became a series of cairns marking the way across vast expanses of broken rock. "Stay close," Holt warned as they navigated a particularly treacherous section where loose scree threatened to send them sliding down a 1,000-foot slope. The rocks here can shift without warning. As they climbed higher, Holt began to notice signs that they weren't the first people to pass this way recently. Boot prints in patches of soft earth, disturbed rocks that didn't look naturally placed, the faint remains of a campfire in a sheltered alcove. "Someone else has been up here," he said, kneeling beside the cold ashes. "Recently? Within the last few weeks, I'd say." Holt stirred the ashes with a stick, finding bits of partially burned wood that would have been completely consumed by weather if they had been here much longer. Maybe other hikers? Maybe. But something about the campsite bothered him. The location was too exposed, too far from any marked trail for casual hikers. Someone had camped here because they had business in this remote country, not because they were seeking recreation. As the afternoon wore on and the shadows began to lengthen, they reached the spot where Holt had planned to make camp for the night. It was a small cirque, surrounded by towering granite walls, with a seasonal spring that provided fresh water and enough flat ground for their tent. "Tomorrow we enter the really wild country," Holt said as they set up camp. "From here on, every step takes us further from any kind of help. Are you having second thoughts?" Holt looked at her across their small camp, this young woman who had literally fallen into his life, bringing with her a purpose he had forgotten he could feel. "No," he said. "For the first time in 20 years, I'm not having second thoughts about anything." The third day brought them into country that tested every skill Holt had learned in a lifetime of mountain travel. They were above 11,000 feet now, where the air was thin enough to make every breath deliberate, and the sun could burn exposed skin in minutes, despite the cool temperature. The landscape had become stark and magnificent, a world of granite spires, snowfields that never melted, and silence so profound it seemed to echo in their bones. "There," Holt said, pointing to a weathered stone marker barely visible among the scattered boulders. "That's the first boundary marker of the old territorial survey." The ancient stone marker stood knee-high, carved with symbols that had been softened by more than a century of wind and weather. But the basic shape was still visible, an arrow pointing north, and below it, letters that might once have indicated survey coordinates or territorial boundaries. "How old do you think it is?" Kiara asked, running her fingers over the worn carvings. "Old enough to predate the fort by decades. This whole area was surveyed and mapped long before they decided to build a military outpost up here." Holt studied the marker, noting how it had been positioned to be visible from multiple directions. Whoever placed this knew what they were doing. They were in the general area, where the fort ruins should be located now, though Holt's maps showed conflicting information about the exact coordinates. Military records from the 1870s were notoriously unreliable when it came to remote outposts, and the harsh mountain environment had a way of erasing human presence with surprising efficiency. "According to my grandmother's notes, there should be more markers," Kiara said, consulting the faded map. She thought they formed a perimeter around something important. The well? Maybe, or maybe something older than the well. As they climbed, Aya, following what might once have been a trail but was now little more than a suggestion in the landscape, they found more evidence of the fort's existence. A rusted piece of metal that could have been part of a buckle or harness fitting, fragments of pottery that looked military in origin, and more stone markers, each one placed with careful attention to sightlines and defensive positioning. "They built this place to watch something," Holt observed as they rested beside another marker. "These aren't just boundary stones, they're observation posts." "Watch what?" "Good question." Holt pulled out his binoculars and scanned the surrounding peaks. "From here, you can see for 50 miles in any direction. If you wanted to monitor movement through these mountains, this would be the perfect spot." The discovery of the markers had energized Kiara in a way that reminded Holt of Thomas when he was pursuing one of his passions. She moved from stone to stone with growing excitement, photographing each one and making notes in a small journal she had carried in her pack. "My mother was an archaeologist," she said during one of their rest stops. "Before I was born, she worked on dig sites all over the southwest. Grandma Rose said she had a gift for reading the landscape, for seeing patterns that other people missed. Is that what brought her up here? Partly. But there was something else, something personal." Kiara's expression grew troubled. "Grandma, Rose let slip once that our family had connections to this area going back generations. But every time I asked for details, she would change the subject." They continued climbing through the afternoon, and as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, the landscape revealed more secrets, the remains of what might have been defensive walls built from stones that had been carefully fitted together without mortar. A depression in the ground that could have been a foundation, and everywhere the sense that they were walking through a place where significant events had unfolded. "Look at this," Holt called from a position near what appeared to be the highest point of the ruins. Kiara joined him beside a circular arrangement of larger stones, each one standing upright like miniature monuments. The pattern was deliberate, unmistakable, and at its center was a depression that had been carved directly into the solid granite of the peak. "The well," she breathed. It was smaller than Holt had expected, perhaps 4 feet across, carved with precision that spoke of serious engineering rather than casual construction. The rim was decorated with symbols that were more elaborate than anything they had seen on the boundary markers, spirals and geometric patterns that seemed to flow into each other with mathematical precision. "This is old," Holt said, kneeling beside the carved rim. Older than the fort, older than the territorial surveys. This predates European settlement by centuries. Kiara was already pulling out her camera, documenting every angle and detail of the well and its surrounding stones. The symbols. I've seen similar ones in my mother's research notes. She thought they might be Native American, but from a tribe that doesn't exist in the historical record anymore. As Holt examined the well more closely, he felt a strange sensation. Not quite recognition, but something that approached familiarity. The craftsmanship reminded him of something, though he couldn't place what. The precision of the carving, the way the symbols seemed to tell a story in a language he almost understood. "There's something else," Kiara said, her voice tight with excitement. "Look at the stones around the perimeter." Holt followed her gaze and saw what she meant. Each of the upright stones bore carvings of its own, and when viewed from the center of the well, they seemed to point towards specific landmarks on the surrounding peaks. It was a navigation system, he realized, but one that recorded information far more complex than simple directional bearings. "Your mother was right," he said. "This place is significant in ways that go beyond anything in the official records." They set up camp as the sun touched the western ridges, painting the granite walls around them in shades of gold and red. The silence was different here, heavier somehow, as if the weight of history pressed down on them like a physical presence. "We'll explore more tomorrow," Holt said, as they prepared a simple dinner over their portable stove. "The light is too uncertain now to do this place justice." But as he spoke, he found himself looking over his shoulder at the well, feeling drawn to it in a way that had nothing to do with archaeological curiosity. There was something about this place that called to him on a level deeper than conscious thought, as if the stones themselves were trying to tell him something important. "Holt," Kiara said quietly, "do you feel it too?" "Feel what?" "Like we're not the first people in our families to stand in this place." He looked at her across their small fire, seeing his own strange sense of connection reflected in her storm-grey eyes. "Yeah," he said, "I feel it too." Dawn came slowly to the high country, seeping through the peaks like spilled silver. Holt woke to find frost covering their tent and his breath visible in the thin air. Beside him, Kiara was already stirring, her eyes bright with the anticipation of someone who was finally close to answers she had sought her entire life. They broke camp quickly, eager to explore the ruins in full daylight. The well looked different in the morning light, less mysterious, more substantial, but somehow more significant. The carved symbols seemed to catch and hold the early sunlight, creating patterns of shadow that emphasized their complexity. "I brought something," Kiara said, pulling a worn object from her pack. "I wasn't sure if it would be useful, but now that we're here," she held up a broken wagon wheel, its wooden spokes weathered gray and one iron rim section missing entirely. It was clearly old, possibly as old as the fort itself, and it had been carefully preserved despite its damaged condition. "Where did you find this?" "In my grandmother's attic, along with my mother's research papers. There was a note with it that said, 'Found near the well, 1955. Grandma Rose never explained what it meant, but she kept it all those years. Holt examined the wheel, noting the craftsmanship that had gone into its construction. This wasn't the kind of mass-produced equipment that had been common in the later frontier period. This wheel had been handmade by someone who understood their craft, probably built to last a lifetime of hard use, a settler's wagon," he said. "But what was a wagon doing this far up in the mountains? There's no possible route that could bring a wagon to this elevation, unless they weren't trying to leave," Kiara said quietly. "Unless they were trying to stay." As they explored the ruins more systematically, they found evidence that supported her theory. The remains of what might have been permanent structures, built not for temporary military occupation, but for long-term settlement. Foundations that suggested buildings designed for families, not just soldiers. And everywhere, the sense that this place had been abandoned, not by choice, but by necessity. "Look at this." Holt called from a section of ruins about 50 yards from the well. He was kneeling beside what appeared to be a grave marker, though unlike any he had seen before. The stone was carved with the same flowing symbols that decorated the well, but these symbols seemed to tell a story. Figures that might represent people, shapes that could be mountains or maybe something else entirely. "There are more," Kiara said, pointing to similar stones scattered throughout the ruins. "It's like a cemetery, but without any names or dates that I can recognize." They spent the morning cataloging what they found, and with each discovery, the picture became more complex. This hadn't been just a military outpost or even a simple settlement. The precision of the construction, the sophistication of the symbol system, the careful integration with the natural landscape, all of it spoke of a community that had understood this place in ways that went far beyond simple survival. "My mother was right," Kiara said, as they took a break beside the well. "This place is connected to something much older and more significant than anyone realized." Holt found himself drawn repeatedly back to the well itself. There was something about it that nagged at him, some detail that his conscious mind couldn't quite grasp, but that felt important. The symbols, the precision of the carving, the way it had been positioned relative to the surrounding peaks. It all seemed familiar in a way that didn't make sense. "Tell me about your father," he said suddenly. "You said he died when you were young. Car accident when I was 6 months old." "I don't remember him at all." Kiara's expression grew puzzled. "Why do you ask? What was his name?" "And Thomas." She paused, something shifting in her expression. "Thomas Henderson, why?" The name hit Holt like a physical blow. For a moment, the thin mountain air seemed to disappear entirely, leaving him gasping. Thomas, not Thomas Matthews, his son, but Thomas Henderson. But the coincidence felt too large, too significant to be random. "What did he look like?" Holt asked, his voice barely steady. Kiara pulled out a small photograph from her wallet, one that had clearly been carried and looked at many times. It showed a young man with dark hair and serious eyes, holding a baby. There was something about the shape of his face, the set of his shoulders, that made Holt's chest tighten with recognition. "He worked construction," Kiara continued. "Met my mother when she was doing research at a historical site near Denver. Grandma Rose said he was fascinated by her work, always asking questions about the places she studied." Holt stared at the photograph, his mind racing. The resemblance wasn't exact, but there were enough similarities to his own son to be disturbing. The same serious expression, the same way of holding his head when concentrating. But more than that, there was something about the timing that made him uncomfortable. When was this picture taken? "A few months before the accident." Grandma Rose said he had been excited about something he had discovered. Some connection between my mother's research and his own family history. But he died before he could explain what he had found. A chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air settled over Holt. Thomas Henderson. The name felt significant, but he couldn't remember why. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a memory was trying to surface, something Thomas had said, or maybe something he had asked about their family history. Did your grandmother ever mention his family? Where he came from originally? Colorado, she thought. But he didn't talk much about his past. Said his family had been scattered by tragedy when he was young. Kiara studied Holt's expression with growing concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have." Holt handed the photograph back to her, with hands that weren't quite steady. How old would he be now if he had lived? 43, the same age his son would have been. Holt felt the wooden cross in his pocket pressing against his chest, and for a moment, the rational part of his mind wondered if the altitude was affecting his judgment. But the feeling of connection, of significance beyond coincidence, was too strong to dismiss. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, then stopped, as the sound of voices carried across the ruins from somewhere below their position. They weren't alone on the mountain anymore. The voices grew closer, and Holt motioned for Kiara to stay low, behind the stone rim of the well. His mountain instincts, honed by decades of wilderness living, told him that anyone who had made the difficult journey to this remote place probably had serious business here, business that might not welcome witnesses. 3 of them, he whispered, listening to the cadence of conversation carried on the thin air. Maybe 4. They're moving systematically through the ruins. Archaeologists, Kiara whispered back. Maybe, but they're not acting like researchers. Holt had heard enough search parties and survey teams over the years to recognize the difference. These people moved with purpose and caution, not the methodical enthusiasm of academics. They waited in tense silence as the voices circled the perimeter of the ruins, gradually working their way toward the central area where the well stood. Holt could make out fragments of conversation now, technical terms he didn't recognize, references to measurements and coordinates, and beneath it all, an urgency that suggested these weren't casual visitors. Told you the GPS coordinates were accurate. I've been looking for this place for 20 years. Symbols. Match the photographs exactly. When the strangers finally came into view, Holt's blood ran cold. 3 men in military-style clothing, carrying equipment that looked more suited to excavation than hiking. The leader was a tall man with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. The other 2 were younger, moving with the disciplined efficiency of people who had worked together before. Dr. Harrison was right, the leader said, approaching the well with obvious satisfaction. This is definitely the site described in the Matthews file. Matthews. Holt's heart nearly stopped. His own surname, spoken by strangers in this impossibly remote place, in connection with discoveries that supposedly predated any European settlement. The coincidence was too specific, too targeted to be random. "Sir," one of the younger men called from near the stone markers. "You need to see this." The leader joined him beside one of the upright stones, and even from their hiding place, Holt could see him react with excitement to whatever he was seeing. "Get the metal detector," the leader ordered. "Start a systematic search of the entire perimeter. If the documents are accurate, there should be a sealed chamber somewhere in this area." Kiara gripped Holt's arm, her eyes wide with questions he couldn't answer. But his attention was focused on something that had just become visible on the stone rim of the well, revealed by the changing angle of the morning sun. There, carved into the granite in letters that had been worn smooth by weather, but were still clearly readable, were the words Thomas H., followed by a date from 25 years ago. Thomas Henderson. Not just any Thomas. Kiara's father had been here. The revelation hit him like an avalanche. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't random discovery. Somehow, the young man who had become Kiara's father had made this same impossible journey a quarter-century ago, had carved his name into this ancient well, and had discovered something significant enough to bring these military searchers back to the same place decades later. "We need to get closer," Kiara breathed. Having seen the carving as well, Holt shook his head, but she was already moving, using the scattered stones and broken walls as cover to work her way toward where they could hear the strangers more clearly. Against his better judgment, he followed, his mountain skills keeping them hidden as they crept closer to the search party. Thomas Henderson's notes were incomplete, but he was definitely on to something, the leader was saying as they came within earshot, disappeared before he could file a complete report. "If the chamber exists, the entrance has to be near the well." Holt felt the world tilt around him as the pieces began falling into place. Thomas Henderson hadn't been just some random young man who had met Kiara's mother by chance. He had been connected to this place, possibly sent here, and his death in that car accident was beginning to look less like random tragedy and more like something deliberate. The search party worked with systematic efficiency, using metal detectors and ground-penetrating equipment to map the subsurface around the well. They clearly knew what they were looking for, and they had the resources to find it. "Contact base," the leader ordered one of his men. "Tell them we've confirmed the site location. We'll need the full excavation team up here within 48 hours. What about the hiking permits? This is federal wilderness area, already taken care of. As far as the Park Service is concerned, we're conducting a routine geological survey." Kiara's grip on Holt's arm tightened as the implications became clear. This wasn't a random search or academic research. This was an organized operation with official backing, and it had been planned around information that Thomas Henderson had gathered 25 years ago. "There," one of the searchers called. "I'm getting a strong signal about 3 feet down, directly north of the well." The leader joined him, and they began setting up what looked like drilling equipment. Whatever was buried there, they intended to reach it. "Sir, we've got visitors." The announcement came from the third searcher, who had positioned himself as a lookout. He was pointing directly toward their hiding place, and Holt realized their cover had been blown. "Come out slowly," the leader called. "We know you're there." Holt exchanged a look with Kiara, weighing their options. They were outnumbered, in the middle of nowhere, and these people clearly had resources and authority that went far beyond anything 2 civilian hikers could challenge. "We're coming out," Holt called back. Standing slowly with his hands visible, they emerged from behind the stone wall, and the leader studied them with obvious interest. His expression suggested recognition, though Holt was certain he had never seen the man before. "Holt Matthews," the leader said, and it wasn't a question. Thomas's father. The words hit Holt like a physical blow. How could this stranger know about his son? How could Thomas be connected to whatever was happening here? "I think you're confused," Holt said carefully. "My son died 20 years ago in a logging accident." "Did he?" The leader's smile was cold. "Or did he die because he discovered something he wasn't supposed to discover? Something about this place and about your family's connection to it?" "What are you talking about?" "Thomas Henderson wasn't the first person in your family to find this place, Mr. Matthews. Your son, Thomas, was here too. In fact, he was here just days before his death, looking for the same thing that brought Thomas Henderson here 25 years ago." The leader gestured toward the well, where the carved name was now clearly visible in the strengthening sunlight. "The difference is, your son Thomas figured out what this place really is, and that knowledge got him killed." Kiara stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "You're saying my father was murdered?" "I'm saying that some secrets are worth killing for, Miss Henderson, and unfortunately for both of you, you've just stumbled into the middle of the biggest secret the United States government has been keeping for the last 150 years. The leader nodded to his men, who began moving to surround them. "The good news is, you're going to help us finish what Thomas Henderson started. The bad news is, after that, you'll have to join the other people who learned too much about this place." Holt felt the wooden cross pressing against his chest, and realized that after 20 years of isolation, he was about to discover the truth about his son's death. But that truth might cost both him and Kiara their lives. The leader's name was Colonel Marcus Webb, and as he explained their situation with clinical detachment, Holt began to understand the true scope of what they had stumbled into. The well wasn't just an archaeological curiosity. It was the center of a mystery that had claimed lives and captured the attention of the highest levels of government. For more than a century, your son Thomas was brilliant, Webb said, gesturing for his men to continue their excavation work while keeping weapons trained on Holt and Kiara. Too brilliant for his own good, he managed to piece together fragments of information that took our researchers decades to compile. "What kind of information?" Kiara demanded, her voice steady despite their circumstances. "Family records, military reports, archaeological surveys that were classified before they were ever completed." Webb pulled out a thick folder from his pack. "Thomas Henderson started the investigation in 1999. He was working construction on a government building renovation in Denver when he found some old files that should have been destroyed years earlier." The colonel opened the folder, revealing photographs, documents, and maps that looked like they had been compiled over many years. Henderson discovered that his family name appeared in territorial records from this area dating back to the 1870s, but these weren't settlement records, they were military. Intelligence reports about activities that posed a potential threat to national security. Holt felt a chill. That had nothing to do with the mountain air. What kind of activities? The kind that made the United States government build a secret military outpost at 11,000 feet in the middle of nowhere. Webb's expression was grim. This place was never officially a fort. It was a containment facility. He showed them a photograph that had clearly been taken from the same vantage point where they now stood. But in the image, the ruins were intact buildings surrounded by high walls and guard towers, built in 1876, abandoned in 1881, 5 years of operation. Then suddenly every person stationed here was transferred to other assignments and all records were sealed. The official story was that the outpost was deemed unnecessary after the end of the Indian Wars, but that wasn't the real reason, Kiara said. The real reason was that they couldn't contain what they found here. Webb pointed toward the well. That's not just a water source. It's an entrance to something that goes much deeper than anyone originally understood, one of Webb's men called out from beside the well, where he had been setting up drilling equipment. Colonel, we've got the first shaft ready. Depth shows approximately 12 feet to the sealed chamber. Excellent. Begin extraction procedures. As the drilling began, Webb continued his explanation, and Holt realized they were being told these secrets not because Webb trusted them, but because he had no intention of letting them leave the mountain alive. Thomas Henderson spent 2 years researching this place. He discovered that several members of his family had been involved in the original fort operations, including one who had been the commanding officer when they made their discovery. But Henderson made the mistake of trying to approach this through official channels. He contacted the government, Holt said. He filed Freedom of Information requests, applied for research permits, wrote letters to senators and congressmen. Webb shook his head, all of which flagged him in our system as someone who knew too much about a project that officially doesn't exist. So you killed him. We arranged for him to have an accident, yes, but not before he had shared his research with someone else, a young archaeologist named Sarah, who was pregnant with his child. Sarah, Kiara's mother. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. My mother knew, Kiara whispered. Your mother was brilliant, just like Henderson. She took his research and advanced it in ways we didn't think were possible. She identified this exact location using nothing but historical fragments and archaeological theory. But more importantly, she figured out what Henderson had missed, which was that this place is connected to other sites across the American West, a network of locations that all share certain characteristics: high altitude, geological stability, and access to underground formations that our best scientists still don't fully understand. The drilling equipment had reached its target depth, and Webb's men were now lowering some kind of fiber optic camera into the shaft they had created. Colonel, one of them called, we've got visual confirmation. The chamber is intact, and there are definitely artifacts present. What kind of artifacts? Unknown composition, sir. But they're giving off some kind of energy signature that's interfering with our equipment. Webb smiled with satisfaction. 25 years of searching, and we're finally going to recover what Thomas Henderson died trying to protect. Holt felt the wooden cross in his pocket and thought about his son, Thomas. About the young man who had died just days after visiting this place. What did my son discover that made him so dangerous? Your son figured out the connection. Webb pulled out another photograph, this one showing a young man who looked heartbreakingly familiar. It was Thomas, but not as Holt remembered him. This was Thomas as an adult, older than he had been when he died, standing beside a woman Holt didn't recognize. This was taken 3 days before his death. Thomas had contacted Sarah Henderson, had shared information with her about family records that went back generations. Together, they had pieced together the truth about this place and about the people who originally built it. What truth? That it wasn't built by Native Americans or early settlers. It was built by people who understood technologies that we're only beginning to comprehend today. And some of those people, including members of both the Henderson and Matthews families, were still alive and active as late as the 1990s. The implications hit Holt like an avalanche. You're saying Thomas discovered living descendants of whoever built this place. I'm saying Thomas discovered that he and Sarah Henderson were descendants of the people who built this place. And that knowledge made them the most dangerous people in America. Kiara stared at the photograph, her face pale with shock. "That woman with your son, is that my mother?" "Sarah Henderson. She disappeared up here 15 years ago, not long after your father's death. We assumed she had died in the wilderness, but her body was never found." "Because she didn't die," Kiara said, understanding flooding her voice. "She found a way down into whatever's below the well." Webb's expression darkened. "Which brings us to why you're both here. Your son," he said to Holt, "left very specific instructions about this place. Instructions that we've spent 20 years trying to decode. But we think the key to understanding them requires someone with the right genetic markers." "Genetic markers?" "The same markers that made Thomas Henderson and Sarah so valuable to our research. The same markers that run in both your families." Webb nodded to his men, who had begun lowering more equipment into the shaft. "We need you to go down there and retrieve what Thomas and Sarah hid. Because, according to our research, the security systems they activated will only respond to someone who shares their bloodline." Holt looked at Kiara and saw his own determination reflected in her storm-grey eyes. Whatever was down there, whatever secrets their families had died to protect, they were about to discover it together. "And if we refuse, then we'll kill you here and spend the next 20 years trying to break through the defenses your families put in place." Webb's smile was cold. "But I don't think you'll refuse. You've both spent too many years looking for answers to walk away now." From the shaft beside the well came a sound that made everyone freeze. A deep, resonant tone that seemed to come from the earth itself, as if something far below had awakened and was responding to their presence. "What was that?" one of Webb's men asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "That," Webb said with satisfaction, "was the sound of a security system that's been waiting 20 years for the right people to come home." He handed Holt an ornate key that looked like it had been forged from some kind of metal that caught and held the light in unusual ways. "This was found among your son's belongings after his death. We've never been able to determine what it opens, but our research suggests it's connected to whatever mechanism controls access to the deeper chambers." The hidden chamber key felt warm in Holt's palm, almost alive, and he knew that holding it marked the point of no return. Whatever lay beneath the well, whatever secrets their families had died to protect, he and Kiara were about to face it together. "Time to find out what your son and Sarah Henderson thought was worth dying for," Webb said, gesturing toward the shaft that would take them deep into the mountain's heart. The descent into the chamber beneath the well was like traveling backward through time itself. The shaft Webb's men had drilled intersected with a much older passage, one that had been carved from the living rock with tools and techniques that predated anything in the archaeological record. The walls were smooth as glass, covered with the same flowing symbols they had seen on the surface. But here, the carvings seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Holt went first, the strange key clutched in one hand and a flashlight in the other, with Kiara following close behind. Webb's men lowered them on climbing ropes, their weapons trained downward in case either of them tried to escape into the darkness below. "Remarkable," Kiara breathed, as her feet touched solid ground 12 feet beneath the well. "These carvings, they're not just decorative. They're telling a story." The chamber they found themselves in was larger than either had expected, carved into a natural cave system that extended far beyond the reach of their lights. But it was clearly not a natural formation. The walls had been shaped by intelligent design, the floor leveled and polished, and throughout the space were arranged objects that defied easy categorization. "Do you see this?" Holt called, his flashlight beam revealing what appeared to be furniture, though unlike any he had ever seen. Chairs and tables carved from stone, but somehow elegant, functional, as if their makers had understood principles of design that made weight irrelevant. But it was what lay at the center of the chamber that made them both stop in stunned silence. A collection of personal belongings, carefully arranged as if their owner had just stepped away for a moment. Modern clothes folded neatly on ancient stone furniture. Contemporary camping equipment sitting beside artifacts that could have been thousands of years old, and in the center of it all, preserved in a silver frame that caught and reflected their flashlight beams, was a family portrait. Kiara reached it first, her hands shaking as she picked up the photograph. Even in the uncertain light, the faces were clearly visible. A young man who could only be Thomas Henderson, a woman with storm-grey eyes who was unmistakably her mother, and between them, a baby who was clearly Kiara herself. "They were here," she whispered. "All three of us were here." Holt studied the photograph over her shoulder and felt his world shift on its axis. The young man in the picture looked familiar in a way that went beyond simple resemblance. The shape of his face, the set of his shoulders, the way he held his head. It was like looking at his own son, Thomas, but somehow different. "As if they were related but from different generations, Kiara," he said quietly. "Look at the date on the back of the frame." She turned it over, and they both saw the inscription: Thomas, Sarah, and Kiara Henderson Matthews, 1999, Henderson Matthews. A hyphenated name that connected both their families in a way that made Holt's head spin with implications. "That's impossible," Kiara said. "My father's name was Henderson. You said your son's name was Matthews. Maybe they weren't different people," Holt said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "Maybe Thomas Henderson was my son Thomas, using a different name for reasons we don't understand yet." But even as he spoke, he knew that wasn't right. The timeline didn't work. His son had died in 2004, and this photograph was dated 1999, yet the resemblance was undeniable, and the hyphenated name suggested a connection that went deeper than coincidence. "There's more here," Kiara said, moving toward a stone shelf that held what appeared to be journals and documents. Letters, maps, research notes, everything my mother was working on when she disappeared. The papers were preserved in some kind of protective covering that had kept them safe from moisture and decay. As Kiara spread them out on one of the stone tables, the scope of her mother's research became clear. Maps showing the locations of similar sites across the American West, genealogical charts that traced both the Henderson and Matthews families back through generations, and scientific notes that suggested Sarah had been investigating phenomena that conventional archaeology couldn't explain. "She figured it out," Kiara said, reading through her mother's careful handwriting. "The connection between our families, the purpose of these sites, the reason the government wanted to keep them secret. What did she figure out?" "We're not descendants of the people who built this place," Kiara said, her voice filled with awe. "We're the people who built this place. Our families have been maintaining and protecting these sites for generations, passing the knowledge down through bloodlines that the outside world never suspected existed." Holt felt the wooden cross in his pocket pulse against his chest, and suddenly understood why it had always felt significant. Not just because he had carved it for his son's grave, but because it was carved in the same style, using the same techniques, as the symbols that covered these ancient walls. "The key," he said, looking down at the ornate object Webb had given him. "This isn't something my son found. This is something my son made." And in that moment, as the truth began to crystallize around them, they heard Sarah's voice calling from deeper in the chamber system, alive, waiting, and ready to explain everything they needed to know about who they really were. Sarah Henderson emerged from the deeper passages like a figure from a dream, older than in the photograph, but unmistakably alive and healthy, despite 15 years of isolation in the underground chambers. Her storm-grey eyes, so like Kiara's, were bright with intelligence and something that might have been relief. "My beautiful daughter," she said, opening her arms as Kiara rushed toward her. "I knew you would find your way here eventually. The bloodline always calls us home." The reunion was everything Kiara had dreamed of for 15 years, but Holt found himself struggling to understand how any of this was possible. The woman embracing her daughter looked no older than she had in the photograph, and her presence in this impossible place raised more questions than it answered. "How?" Kiara managed between tears. "How are you here? How have you survived?" Sarah smiled. And in that expression Holt saw echoes of his own son's face. "Because this place isn't just a hiding spot, honey. It's a sanctuary that's been maintained by our family for generations. Everything we need to survive is here: food, water, power sources that work on principles your modern science is only beginning to understand." She led them deeper into the chamber system, through passages that opened into rooms that defied rational explanation. Libraries carved from living rock, filled with books and documents in languages Holt couldn't identify. Workshops containing tools and equipment that looked both ancient and impossibly advanced. Living quarters that had been designed for long-term habitation by people who understood comfort and necessity in equal measure. "This is where we really come from," Sarah explained as they walked. "Not from European settlers or Native American tribes, but from something older, something that existed on this continent long before any of the peoples your history books recognize. The government knew," Holt said. "Webb and his people. They've been searching for this place for decades. They've been trying to find us for more than a century," Sarah corrected. "Ever since their scientists first detected energy signatures that didn't match anything in their understanding of physics. But they've never understood what they were really looking for." She stopped beside a stone table where a sealed letter waited, addressed in handwriting that Holt recognized with a shock of recognition. "From my son," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "From our son," Sarah corrected gently. "Thomas Matthews Henderson." He used both family names because he understood the connection even when the rest of us were still learning. The letter was written in Thomas's careful script, and as Holt read it aloud, the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. "Dad, if you're reading this, it means Kiara found you and brought you home. I know this will be hard to understand, but everything we thought we knew about our family was incomplete. The Matthews line and the Henderson line aren't separate families. We're different branches of the same ancient bloodline, one that's been entrusted with protecting sites like this for thousands of years." Sarah and I discovered the truth when we realized that our genetic markers weren't just similar. They were complementary, designed to work together to access the deepest chambers and the most important knowledge. Kiara carries both bloodlines, which makes her the key to everything our ancestors built. I had to fake my death to protect this secret from the government agents who were closing in. Sarah had to disappear for the same reason, but we always knew that someday, when Kiara was old enough and the time was right, she would bring our family back together. The key I left for you will open the final chamber, where our ancestors stored the knowledge that could change everything: clean energy, sustainable technology, methods of living in harmony with the natural world that could solve the crises your generation is facing. But this knowledge comes with responsibility. Our family are the guardians, not the owners. We can share what we've learned, but only with people who will use it wisely. Welcome home. Dad, welcome to who we really are." Holt looked up from the letter to find Sarah watching him with gentle patience. "Thomas is still alive," she said. "He's been living in the deep chambers, maintaining the systems our ancestors built. He's been waiting 20 years for this family reunion. But the body, the funeral, someone else who volunteered to help us protect the secret. A man who had no family, who understood what was at stake." Sarah's expression grew sad. "His sacrifice allowed Thomas to disappear completely and focus on learning what our ancestors knew." The sound of drilling from above reminded them that Webb and his team were still working to reach them, still determined to claim whatever secrets lay hidden in the depths. "They can't be allowed to succeed," Sarah said, her voice hardening. "What's down here isn't meant for governments or militaries. It's meant for people who understand that some knowledge requires wisdom to handle safely." She handed Kiara a small device that looked like it had been grown rather than manufactured. "The chamber lockdown system. When the time comes, you'll know what to do." From somewhere far above, then came the sound of ropes being lowered and boots hitting stone as Webb's team prepared to follow them into the depths. The final confrontation was about to begin. The journey back to Holt's cabin took 3 days, but they traveled as a family, reunited across generations and bloodlines that had been separated by necessity and deception. Thomas Matthews Henderson, for that was indeed his full name, walked beside his father for the first time in 20 years, their relationship transformed by understanding and forgiveness. He looked older than his 43 years, weathered by 2 decades of living in the ancient chambers, but his eyes held the same curiosity and determination that Holt remembered from his youth. The son who had died in Holt's memory had been reborn as a guardian of secrets that could reshape the world. "I never meant for you to suffer," Thomas said as they descended through the familiar pine forests toward home. "But if I had contacted you after faking my death, Webb's people would have found the chambers within months. I understand now." Holt replied, though the words still felt strange after so many years of grief. "But 20 years is a long time to mourn someone who was still alive. It was the only way to protect what matters most." Thomas gestured toward Kiara, who was walking ahead with her mother, their voices mixing with the sound of wind through the trees as they shared 15 years of stories. "She's the future of everything our family has protected. Both bloodlines converge in her. She can access chambers and knowledge that neither you nor I could reach alone." Behind them, the ancient site lay sealed beneath tons of collapsed stone. Kiara had used the device her mother gave her to trigger systems their ancestors had built for exactly this purpose: protection against those who would exploit rather than honor the knowledge contained within. Webb and his team had barely escaped. With their lives, and the entrance they had carved was now buried so completely that even advanced technology would take decades to excavate. "What about the other sites?" Holt asked. Sarah mentioned there were more places like this across the West. Dozens of them. Some are still active, maintained by other family lines who share our responsibility. Others have been lost or compromised over the centuries. Thomas paused to help his father navigate a tricky section of trail. "Our job now is to reconnect with the other guardian families, to rebuild the network that kept this knowledge safe for thousands of years." As they approached the familiar clearing where Holt's cabin stood, he felt a profound shift in his understanding of what home meant. For 20 years, this place had been a refuge from a world that held too much pain. Now it would become the center of a family that had found its way back to itself. "We'll need to expand the cabin," he said, looking at the small structure with new eyes. "Make room for everyone." "I've been thinking about that," Thomas said. "There are techniques our ancestors developed for building that work with the natural systems of the mountain rather than against them. We could create something that looks traditional from the outside, but incorporates principles that make it almost self-sustaining." That evening, as they sat around a fire that blazed in the hearth Holt had built with his own hands, the 4 of them planned a future that honored both the ancient knowledge they protected and the modern world they inhabited. Sarah had spent 15 years studying the archives in the deep chambers, learning technologies that could provide clean energy, sustainable agriculture, and medical techniques that surpassed anything available to contemporary science. "But we can't just release this knowledge indiscriminately," she cautioned. "Our ancestors learned that wisdom comes slowly, that societies need time to develop the ethical frameworks necessary to handle advanced capabilities responsibly. So, we start small," Kiara said, carving a simple wooden cross with tools her grandfather had taught her to use. "We help individuals, families, communities that are ready to receive what we can share. We build trust and understanding gradually." The cross she carved was identical to the one Holt had carried for 20 years, and as he watched her work, he understood that she was creating not just a memorial, but a symbol of continuity. The knowledge and skills that had been passed down through generations would continue to flow through this family line, adapted to new challenges, but rooted in the same principles of stewardship and protection. "Thomas," Holt said, using his son's name for the first time in 2 decades without pain, "I owe you an apology for not understanding your dreams, for not supporting your desire to explore beyond these mountains. You supported me in the ways that mattered most, Thomas replied. You taught me to love this place, to understand that real strength comes from knowing when to stand firm and when to bend. Everything I learned about protecting what matters, I learned from watching you. As the fire settled into glowing coals and the mountain night embraced them with its familiar silence, Holt felt the weight of 20 years of grief finally lifting from his shoulders. The wooden cross in his pocket no longer represented loss and regret. It had become a symbol of faith restored, of family bonds that had proven stronger than deception, distance, or even death itself. Outside their cabin, the mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, holding their secrets close, but no longer hiding the truth from those who belonged among them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they began the work of rebuilding connections with other guardian families and carefully sharing knowledge that could help heal a wounded world. But tonight, for the first time since Thomas was young, Matthews fell asleep surrounded by family, listening to voices he loved, talking quietly by firelight about dreams that had finally found their way home. The new wooden cross sat on the mantel beside the old one, not replacing the grief and remembrance it represented, but adding hope and continuity to a story that was far from over. In carving it, Kiara had honored both her grandfather's loss and her father's sacrifice, creating a bridge between past sorrow and future possibility that would guide their family through whatever challenges lay ahead.